So last time we met, we were talking about the neoclassical model from week 3. And in the neoclassical model, we saw that there's 4 components to it. Say's law, the labor market, the production function, and the quantity theory of money. Okay? That model was dominant in economics from about 1870 until 1935. Okay? It was unrivaled. That was the explanation of how capitalism worked. Okay? Now, in 1929, in America, the stock market crashed, right? And the Great Depression began. When the Great Depression began, suddenly there's 25% unemployment, there's breadlines. If you remember the term Hooverville, right? It was a lot of people who were essentially homeless, right? Living in these communal towns, shelters, in cardboard boxes or whatever scrap they could pull together. The Great Depression was not a good time in this country, obviously. Also, it's important to remember that in Europe itself, Europe's Great Depression began in about 1918, 1919. Okay? America came out of World War I relatively unscathed, right? Because none of our stuff was destroyed. The war was fought over in Europe. However, in Europe, they had just experienced World War I on their soil, right? Towns in complete villages and towns were destroyed, okay? So, since those towns and villages were destroyed, they didn't have any production capabilities, right? All the factories and stuff like that no longer existed because they'd been blown up, okay? So Europe came out of World War I and went right into the Great Depression. So in Europe, the Depression actually lasted in the 20s and the 30s, okay? In the midst of all this, 25, 30% unemployment, breadlines, mass poverty, stock market crashes, people started saying, maybe the neoclassical model is wrong, right? It seems like these people, the unemployed, 25, 30% unemployed, want to work, they just simply can't find a job, right? They're willing to work at whatever wage is currently prevalent, but they can't actually secure a job. Not for lack of skills, right? It's that nobody will hire them. So why would nobody hire them? Well, this called into question the neoclassical theory, right? Neoclassical theory says anyone who's trying to find a job will find one as long as they're willing to work at the prevailing real wage. Okay? Well, that seemed to be wrong. So there was a need for a new theory. Okay? Now remember, this is the 1930s. Okay? In the 1930s, in this country even, right, but in Europe as well, there was actually the rise of a significant communist party or a socialist party. Okay? The one nation that actually missed the Great Depression was the USSR. They didn't experience it because they weren't a capitalist nation. The Great Depression only applied to capitalist nations. The USSR became the USSR in 1917 or 1918. I'm not sure. But with the Romanov Revolution, right? The Bolshevik Revolution. So that's who missed, right? The USSR missed the Great Depression. So if there's 25, 30% unemployment, breadlines, things like that, people started saying, well, in America and in Europe, we're stuck in poverty. Russia is actually growing quite quickly. Maybe we should be a communist nation. Okay? That's the mindset that was going on at the time. Okay? Now, it wasn't like everyone in the whole world wanted to be a socialist or a communist, but there was a significant following for socialism, to the point that a socialist actually ran as a candidate for U.S. presidents in the 1930s. Okay? senators were elected who were members of the Socialist Party. Okay? Imagine if that was to happen today, right? It's unbelievable if that would happen today. Not unbelievable in a good or a bad way, just you can't see it happening. So, what you ended up having was a need for a theory that could explain how to end the Great Depression without nations becoming communist. Okay? This is where John Maynard Keynes comes in. Keynes, as I mentioned, was a student of Marshall. He was raised as a neoclassical economist. He was a neoclassical economist in his early years. Okay? But he's looking around and saying, you know, the neoclassical model does not seem to be able to explain what's going on here. Okay? And in fact, the neoclassical model during the Great Depression would say, don't worry, it's a temporary, problem, but the labor market will adjust, self-adjusting mechanism, and as long as you're willing to work at the going wage, you may be out of a job now, but in the long run, you will get a job. Okay? Markets will adjust, and capitalism will go back to being a socially harmonious economic system. Okay? Well, Keynes has this famous quote that says, well, in the long run, we're all dead. Right? Meaning, markets may in fact adjust. But the Great Depression has been going on for 15 years, 20 years. We can't just sit around and wait for the markets to fix themselves, if they do in fact fix themselves. Instead, we need to figure out a way to end the Depression now. Okay? So, that's the backdrop against which Keynes is writing, okay, the historical backdrop. There's one other thing I would just like to point out to you. Keynes was a wealthy Cambridge Don. Okay? His father was a professor at Cambridge in England. Keynes was a professor at England, and he was from a very wealthy family, very conservative family. Okay? Socially, he was more or less fairly conservative, which is going to seem odd when we start talking about his economic policies. Okay? Conservatively, he had fancy parties and galas at his mansions and things like that. Right? Very reserved, very calm. He took in the arts a lot, the opera and the ballet particularly. But his economic policies, one could characterize them as being fairly left these days. Okay? I bring that up because most of the time Keynes is portrayed as a socialist, right? If you are in favor of Keynes's policies, you are somehow far, far to the left in economics. You're a liberal, you're a socialist democrat, or you're just a communist, right? That's the way most people think of Keynes today. But if you think about the historical background against which I told you Keynes was writing, Keynes wrote this famous article saying more or less that the USSR's economic system is not sustainable and that communism is simply a religion. Okay? He was not in favor of communism at all. He was completely against it. He was not a socialist. No chance. He was very far from it. All one needs to just read his book, Essays in Persuasion, and that will become obvious. What Keynes was trying to do was to save capitalism, right? You have the Great Depression. These people there's high unemployment. The masses of people are starting to think maybe we should be a communist nation instead of a capitalist nation. And Keynes was writing to say, no, this is how you can fix the Depression and make capitalism sustainable so that we won't become socialists or communists. Okay? So it's sort of ironic today when people label Keynes as a socialist. It's ironic because he was actually writing to save capitalism. Right? He was completely against socialism. Okay? One might suspect that someone who is a socialist would not be trying to save capitalism. Okay? So it's very ironic in that sense. Against that historical backdrop, now we're going to talk about Keynes and the post-Keynesians. Okay? The document I'm going to go through is simply labeled Keynes's General Theory, and at points during it, like with the second lecture, the first and the second lecture, I believe, I'm going to shut off the overhead, and then I'll start using the blackboard a little, and then we'll go back to the overhead, etc., things like that, so I can explain some concepts more in depth for you. Okay? So, I think this is still in. This is, and I'd like to point out, this is Keynes, not the textbook Keynesians. This is Keynes and the post-Keynesians, okay? So if you remember our history of economic thought tree, this is the left side. Now we're on the left side, which says capitalism inherently creates poverty, inequality, and unemployment, okay? Some individuals can choose to be lazy, and what they end up doing is they could end up in poverty. That's true. But you're going to have that regardless of whether the system is capitalist, communist, feudalist, traditional society, whatever. You're going to have that in any society. Okay? You call those people cheaters. Okay? But what we're fundamentally looking at here is, are a lot of people in capitalism unemployed simply because they want to find a job, but they can't secure one? Okay? When General Motors failed in 2008, it might have been 2009, when General Motors went bankrupt, essentially what we're looking at is all the workers that General Motors was going to fire, were they going to be unemployed because they were lazy, or was it because the capitalist system itself would cause them to be unemployed? Okay? That's what we're talking about. So here on the left side, which Keynes and the post-Keynesians belong to, says that poverty, inequality, and unemployment is caused by capitalism itself. Okay? So this is Keynes. Keynes's overriding concern was with employment. Okay? He was concerned with growth and employment. He also had a theory of price determination. Right? He knew what determined prices, which we're going to get to, but he was really concerned with employment, which makes sense. Okay? If you have everyone working, right? If all of your labor resources are working as productively as they can be, then your economy is maximizing its output, right? Maximizing output meaning you're making as much stuff as you possibly can if everyone is fully employed, okay? That's the first reason why Keynes was concerned with unemployment. The second one is he was writing during the Great Depression when there was 25% unemployment, right? So if you wanted to solve capitalism's problems, if you wanted to fix the Great Depression, it seemed like you should probably dedicate yourself to solving the unemployment problem, okay? So Keynes was concerned with employment, okay? He wanted to know how to eliminate involuntary unemployment, okay? Involuntary unemployment. What that means is, let's take the opposite of it. Let's look at voluntary unemployment. Voluntary unemployment just simply means you choose leisure, right? I don't want to work at this wage, so I'm going to go and I'm going to sit on the couch. That's fine. If you choose that, then that's the lot you make in life. Okay? Keynes was concerned with involuntary unemployment. Okay? People who want jobs but can't find them. Specifically, he was looking at a situation in which the labor supply is greater than the labor demand, right? There's a surplus of labor. If the labor supply is greater than the labor demand, that means more people want jobs than actually have them. Okay? He was looking at labor supply is greater than labor demand. So what he ended up doing was called that involuntary unemployment, right? There's a surplus of workers who want jobs but can't find one. It's important to remember here, the neoclassical school simply assumes you get to full employment, okay? Right? The neoclassical school uses the labor market to assume the economy will always be at full employment, right? If you're willing to work at this wage, then you will find a job because labor supply is always equal to labor demand, okay? Keynes, in chapter 2 of his book, wrote a scathing critique of that, okay? He really took it to the neoclassicals and said, look, this is where you're wrong in parts, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. There was 8 basic points that he made as to why the neoclassical labor market is wrong. Okay? So he said, neoclassical labor market is wrong, completely rejected it. Okay? Said there's no way that it could be true. The critiques itself, I wish we could go over the critiques of it, but they're a little bit advanced for this course, so we're not going to go into it. Just briefly, I'll tell you, but you're not required to know this. Essentially, Keynes said there's no way that labor, the labor supply in the aggregate, can determine what the market clearing real wage would be. Okay? But that's it. That's all I'm going to talk about it, and we're moving on. Okay? Because it's not required for this course, it's an advanced thought. Okay? It's more towards intermediate or graduate level economics. Okay? But again, the neoclassicals assume full employment. Okay? The labor market basically says you're always going to be at full employment. Well, during the Great Depression, that was really hard to uphold, right? People are in breadlines, and neoclassical economists are saying, we're at full employment, don't worry, we're at full employment. People would say, I'd like a job, but I can't find one. And then they'd say, well, it's just a temporary glitch in markets, but in the long run, you'll find a job. Don't worry. In a couple of years, things are going to turn around. To which someone would say, like Keynes, well, in the long run, I'm going to be dead, right? Now note, you still hear that from President Obama's mouth and Hillary, right? You hear from them, in a few years, the economy's going to turn around. It's going to get steam. It's going to get rolling, okay? All of the, whether it's Democrat or Republican, you hear the recovery is underway and things are improving, okay? All of those people come from a neoclassical belief that markets will fix themselves. It just might take a little bit of time. Keynes completely rejected that. He said, look, you can be stuck with involuntary unemployment for years at a time. Okay? And I'm going to show you how in a little bit. But he said, you can be stuck with involuntary unemployment for years at a time. Okay? You can have high levels of unemployment for decades on end. If you don't believe me, just look at Japan. Right? Japan was China. Right? The way we think of China today, 30 years ago, that was Japan. And then in 1990, Japan's stock market crashed. And they've been stagnating ever since. Okay? So this idea that the economy is coming back around, it has to come around eventually, is neoclassical. It's not what Keynes said. Keynes simply said that if the level of spending is too low, you will be stuck with unemployment forever. Okay? We're going to get to that, but that's what Keynes's fundamental message was. If your level of spending is too low, you will permanently be stuck with unemployment. Okay? So that's an important point. Now we're going to come and elaborate on that point. Okay? Keynes's biggest contribution, there's many of them. Keynes has a lot of contributions to economics. He's easily the most important economist of the 1900s. I would argue the most important economist ever. Okay? But Keynes, his biggest contribution, sadly it's also sometimes his most overlooked contribution, but his biggest contribution is what he called effective demand. Okay? He wanted to know what determined the level of employment and output. Okay? In other words, how do you get more people to work, and once they're working, they will begin making more stuff. Okay? So output goes up. So he wanted to know what determined output and employment. He said the key, the one thing that determines output and employment is the level of spending. Okay? It's what he called effective demand. Keynes called the level of spending effective demand. So for Keynes, okay, let's think back now for a second to the neoclassical model. The neoclassical model's theory of expenditure was Say's law. Okay? It was Say's law, which said supply creates its own demand. Okay? In other words, if people start producing things, then there will be spending. Okay? Keynes rejected Say's law completely. Okay? Keynes said that it was the biggest fallacy in economics ever. Okay? Keynes said that demand is what determines supply. Okay? If there's enough spending, then a business will make it. Okay? Which seems a little bit more in line, right? If people want to buy something, a bunch of entrepreneurs will go into business producing it. But nobody's going to start producing something thinking there will be spending on it, right? It could be a horrible idea. You have to think people are going to buy it. Right? So neoclassical economics is called supply-side economics, whereas Keynes's economics was demand-side. Okay? It was demand-side economics. So enough of that. Here's the principle of effective demand. It's actually quite simple. Okay? He put it in very grandiose terms in his book. The first line of the book, of the general theory, is, "This book is chiefly addressed to my fellow economists." So he wrote at a very technical level. But this idea is quite simple, and we can talk about it in intro terms. Okay? What determines the level of employment and output? Effective demand. What is effective demand? Well, Keynes said that the way you create employment, if you want to raise the level of employment, you follow this rule, right? Spending creates income. Okay, spending creates income. That's an identity, right? We already know that. If I go to 7-Eleven and I buy a Slurpee, when I spend my money, that becomes the 7-Eleven employee's income. Okay? So Keynes said spending creates income. Income, in turn, creates sales. Okay? Income creates sales. The more income people have, the more they're going to go out and buy things. So businesses will sell more. Okay? So far we have spending creates income, income creates sales, and sales creates jobs. Right? The more a cash register goes off, sales. The more a cash register goes off because more sales are being made, then the more likely it is that business is going to hire more workers and build more stores. Right? Maybe you have a 7-Eleven at Journal Square, but if you have a lot of sales at Journal Square, maybe you're going to put a 7-Eleven in at McGinley Square. Right? Simple example, but the point is conveyed. the more sales a business makes, the more likely they are to start hiring more people and expanding, right? If Ford starts selling a lot of cars, then they're going to have to build another Ford factory. Okay? So, here we go. If you want to tie it all together, spending creates income. Income creates sales. Sales creates jobs. Therefore, spending creates jobs. That's Keynes. That's effective demand. Okay? The most important thing he did in economics is he showed that the more people spend, the more sales will be made, which means the more jobs will be created. So therefore, what determines the level of output and employment? Sales. Okay? It has to be spending. That is how you can ultimately create more jobs. That leads to the curious idea, does that mean that saving is bad? We're going to come back to that in a minute. Interestingly enough, I'm trying to tie in Keynes with our contemporary economic events. Okay? Every time a worker is fired, you have to report why that worker was fired. Okay? In every survey we see of businesses for the last 6-7 years, ever since 2008, why are people being fired? Okay? The vast majority, it's something like 95-96% of people, are being fired by their bosses because their boss says there's not enough sales. Okay? The company isn't selling enough things to justify keeping that worker. Right? The worker works and produces stuff, but they're not selling it. So the company doesn't need the guy to keep, or girl, to keep working there, right? Because they're not making any sales. Just while we're at it, taxes being, in these surveys, taxes being too high is usually about 0.8, 0.9%. Okay? So less than 1% of businesses say that taxes are too high, and that's why they're firing people. Also, about 0.5% say that there's too many regulations. Okay? So just to put this in context today, most of the right wing, most of the Republican Party currently argues that the US economy is stuck still in sort of neutral because taxes are too high and there's too many regulations. So what the US needs to do is lower taxes on the rich and get rid of all of its regulations. Well, according to businesses, the people who actually hire and fire people, that solution is only relevant for about 1.5% of the economy. Okay? On the other hand, if we could raise the level of spending, what you end up getting is a solution that is relevant for about 95% of the economy. Okay? So it seems the way out of this crisis is we need to raise the level of spending. Because if you raise spending, then you create more income. More income leads to more sales. More sales creates more jobs. Okay? Just think about it like this. How do you get businesses to hire people? You get their cash registers to go off more. And there's only one way that you can make a cash register go off. You have to make a sale. Right? Spending is the lifeblood of capitalism. Okay? Capitalism requires sales in order to survive. Without sales, there can be no profit. Okay? So, let's move on now just a little bit. I think I've hammered home the effective demand point. Keynes also differed from the neoclassicals in another way. He said that the economy was a monetary production economy. Okay? Keynes said that money was the most important thing a person could have or hold. Okay, if you remember from our lecture in week 1. I mentioned a monetary production economy can be monetary production economy can be represented as MCM prime. Okay, MCM prime, where the goal is to start with money, buy a commodity, and then sell that commodity for more money than you started with. Okay? So money is the most important thing in capitalism. It's what you want, right? You need to get your hands on money. Okay. If you decide to hold money, right? If you have a pile of money and you just hold on to it, okay? Instead of spending it, then sales go down, right? If everyone decides to hold on to their money, I hold on to my money, you hold on to your money, and everyone holds on to their money, then that's called savings. If everyone saves their money, then no one is actually spending anything, which means cash registers will never go off. Okay? Spending is the only way you can make a cash register go off. So if everyone holds money, then sales go down and revenue goes down. Okay? If revenue goes down, businesses start going bankrupt, at which point you don't need any workers. Okay? So, if people hold money instead of spending it, unemployment can result. Okay? Unemployment can result. What that means for Keynes is he said that money is non-neutral. Okay? And that's a new definition that we have to go through. Okay? He said money is non-neutral, which means that it impacts the level of output and employment. Okay? If people decide to hold money, right? I have my stack of cash here. If people hold money, then they're not spending it. And if people don't spend, then cash registers don't go off and unemployment goes up. So my decision to hold money causes unemployment to go up. So money is non-neutral because money has an impact on the level of employment and output. Okay, so money is non-neutral in the short run and the long run, but money is always non-neutral. That is different from the neoclassicals. The neoclassicals say that money is always neutral. Okay? In other words, money has no impact whatsoever on the level of output and employment. Well, how can that be? Just remember the neoclassical model. The neoclassicals say the level of employment is determined by the labor market. Okay? The labor market, we didn't talk about money at all. So the labor market doesn't require money, so that's what determines the level of employment. Also, the level of output is determined by the production function. Okay, the production function. So, there was no money in the production function either. So since money didn't explain the level of employment or the level of output, it's said to be neutral. Right? Money has no impact on output or employment for the neoclassical school. However, for Keynes, it's the complete opposite. If I decide to hold money, then I don't spend it, and if I don't spend it, cash registers don't go off, and you don't need people to be working there. Okay? So therefore, for Keynes, money is always non-neutral, right? Money does determine the level of output and employment. Okay? I mentioned before, Keynes's major contribution was the overthrow of Say's law, which he replaced with effective demand. Okay? This effective demand is the spending leads to jobs thing, right? Spending is what he called effective demand. he overthrew Say's law and replaced effective demand with this equation, which we're going to go over in a second, and his monetary asset pricing theory of investment. Okay? He had a theory of investment, a financial theory of investment, which we're going to talk about as well. At this time, I'm going to shut off the, well, actually, we'll talk about this very briefly, and then I'll start going into it. Okay? I'm just going to talk about the consumption section, and then I'm going to turn off the overhead and do some stuff on the board. Okay? Keynes said that consumption was relatively stable, okay? And he came up with this idea of the marginal propensity to consume. Okay? So if capitalism was relatively stable, if consumption was relatively stable, he asked, why did capitalism have all these booms and busts? Right? Why did we see capitalism going like this? Right? If consumption is stable, right, you buy a pizza, slice a day, whatever. If consumption is stable, why does the economy go like that? And the answer, he said, was investment. Okay? He said investment was very volatile. Okay? Now I'm going to shut off the overhead and we'll talk more about consumption. Okay, so Keynes created this consumption theory, right? But his consumption theory is about that much of the book. The real portion of his book is about that big, and it's dedicated to investment. But first we need to go over consumption. Keynes said that effective demand can be split up into two categories. Okay? Effective demand is equal to consumption plus investment. Okay? That's what Keynes said. Consumption plus investment is effective demand. It's the total level of spending. Just FYI, he had a closed economy, meaning there was no trade. Okay? It's very easy to incorporate trade into his theory. People have done it. We're not going to go through that. It was a closed economy. Okay? So we're just going to talk about that for now. The neoclassical model was also closed, if you hadn't noticed. There was no trade in the neoclassical model that we talked about. Okay? So, for Keynes, effective demand was equal to consumption plus investment. So the total amount of things people consumed, beer, pizza, burritos, whatever, right? That's consumption. That plus investment, the amount of buildings people build, the amount of factories we need, the amount of cars that were made, the level of the stock market, okay? So consumption plus investment equals the total level of spending, okay? So that's Keynes's major contribution, effective demand. Now we're going to talk about consumption. Keynes said there were two components of consumption. Okay? Well, before I even get that far, I want to write another equation on the board. Say's law, if you remember, was this. The first equation in Say's law was this. Right? Where we said that income is equal to consumption, which is a function of the interest rate, plus savings, which is a function of the interest rate. Okay? Keynes rejected that. I told you he rejected Say's law completely. Okay? Keynes said that income was equal to this. Okay? Keynes said that the total level of income and employment was equal to consumption, which was a function of your expected income. Okay? If you expected your income to continue, you would keep continuing to consume, which we're going to talk about in a second. Okay? I just wanted to backtrack before we talked about consumption. I wanted to put this equation up. Okay? So effective demand, C plus I, right? Now I've expanded it to this and this. Okay? So effective demand, or income, is equal to consumption, which is a function of your expected income, plus investment, which is related to the interest rate. Okay? Investment is related to the interest rate. So this is different from Say's law. It's very different. Okay? Now, especially, and you'll see it's very different once we start talking about investment, but for now let's talk about consumption. Keynes divided consumption up into two parts. Okay? He said there was autonomous consumption and discretionary consumption. Okay? So the total level of consumption is equal to autonomous consumption plus, so this is A plus BY. Okay? A is autonomous consumption. BY is what's known as discretionary consumption. Okay? And I'm going to explain this all in a second. So if you combine autonomous consumption with discretionary consumption, you get the total level of consumption. Okay? Now, what is autonomous consumption? Autonomous consumption is simply things you will consume no matter what your income level is. Okay? So, you can think of it as basic needs, food, clothing, shelter, right? No matter whether or not you have a job, you're still going to try to spend some money on food, right? You need to, or else you will die. So, that's autonomous consumption, okay? It's things you're going to purchase regardless of whether or not you have income, okay? If you don't have income, maybe you'll spend out of your savings, okay? But that's autonomous consumption. Discretionary consumption depends upon your income. Okay? Discretionary consumption depends upon your income. That's why we have a Y here, okay? Y is income, okay? Discretionary consumption depends upon your income. So now I've already gone through C. C is total consumption. A is autonomous consumption. And Y is income. And BY is discretionary income, or discretionary consumption. Okay? I haven't explained what B yet is, because I wanted to cover all the bases before we actually got to B. Okay? B is quite important in this whole scenario, in this theory. B is something called the marginal propensity to consume. Okay? B is the marginal propensity to consume. What that means is, out of every dollar you earn, so your income, Y, right? Out of every dollar you earn, Y, how much of that dollar do you go out and spend for discretionary consumption? So let's say you get a $100 raise, okay? If you got a $100 raise, if your income, Y, went up $100, okay? And you decided you wanted to go to Macy's and buy yourself a nice sweater, something, I don't know. Then, and it was $60, so you spent $60 out of your extra $100. Then your marginal propensity to consume would be 0.6. Okay, how did I get that? 60 divided by 100 is 0.6. It's the extra amount, it's the amount of every extra dollar you will spend. Okay? So if you haven't, on the other hand, if you decided to buy a sweater and headphones that totaled up $90, then your marginal propensity to consume would be 0.9. It's the total extra amount of money you spend, it's the percent of every extra dollar you spend when your income goes up. Okay? So B times Y is known as discretionary consumption. Why discretionary consumption? Because it's made at your discretion. You have a choice as to whether or not you are going to buy the sweater or the headphones. Okay? It's at your discretion. You can choose. Autonomous, right? Autonomous consumption means you don't have a choice, right? You cannot choose whether or not you do or don't want to buy food. I suppose you could choose, but then you're going to die, right? You don't get to choose with autonomous consumption. It's things you're going to spend or consume no matter what. Whereas with discretionary consumption, with B times Y, with discretionary consumption, you don't get to choose. You're going to purchase, sorry, I take that back. You get to choose. You can decide whether or not you want the sweater or you don't. Okay? You can walk into Macy's and spend the $60, or you can walk into Macy's and keep the $60. Okay? If you got a raise of $100 and you didn't spend any extra of it, your marginal propensity to consume would be 0. Okay? On the other hand, if you decided that you wanted to spend all $100, it would be 1. Okay? So that is the marginal propensity to consume. The name comes from, it's the marginal, the extra amount. You have a propensity, you are inclined to consume, right? It's the extra amount you're inclined to purchase, to consume. Okay? So when your income goes up $100, it's the extra amount you are inclined to spend, which if you just bought a sweater was $60. If you decided to buy the sweater and the headphones, it would be $90. The extra amount you are inclined to spend. Okay? So it's always a fraction. The lowest the marginal propensity to consume can be is 0. Okay? It's 0. If you get $100 extra and you choose to spend none of it, 0 divided by 100 is 0. If you spend all of your money, if you spend all $100, then it's 100 divided by 100, which is 1. So the marginal propensity to consume goes between 0 and 1. Okay? Now, it's important to remember, consumption is stable. Okay? People usually spend the same amount of money on food, clothing, and shelter every month. Right? It may change a little bit, but it's basically the same amount. Okay? So autonomous consumption doesn't really change. And discretionary consumption changes a little bit, but not a lot. I mean, maybe at Christmas time you buy some extra gifts for people, or every so often you treat yourself to a nice dinner and a new sweater, a new outfit, right? But for the most part, you're not running out and completely redoing your whole wardrobe, and this month you're going to eat nothing but rice at your house and then go out and eat steak the next month, right? You pretty much consume the same amount month to month, right? Autonomous consumption, you consume the same there. Discretionary consumption, you consume about the same there. So if you put the two together, total consumption is usually about the same amount month to month. Okay? I bring that up because if consumption is relatively stable, then it means the economy won't have very big peaks and troughs. Right? We won't have a business cycle that is huge. Okay? The economy won't go way up and then go way down, and then go way up and way down. No, you'll be spending the same amount every month, right? So if spending is what matters, then what you end up getting is the economy and its employment level will be relatively stable, okay? The more you can encourage people to consume, right, the higher the level of consumption, as long as it's not financed by debt. Okay? As long as you're not financing consumption through debt. But if you're financing consumption out of income, okay, then the more the economy is dependent on consumption, the steadier it will be, which means employment won't change all that much. Okay? Now, let's talk about 3 different concepts, which I'm going to write on the board. Multiplier, paradox of thrift, and the causality of it. Okay? The multiplier is quite an interesting concept. Okay? And the multiplier comes from the marginal propensity to consume. Okay? So I'm going to erase this now and we'll start doing an example of the multiplier. Okay. The multiplier, what the multiplier says, is that if there is an increase of spending, there will be an increased level of income that is a greater number than the increased level of spending. Okay? So let me say that again, and now I'm going to use the word multiple in it. If there is an increased level of spending, then income will go up by a multiple of that. Okay? So an easy example of this is if spending goes up $100, income can actually go up $500. You might say, Devin, how can that be? Dr. Rafferty, that's not, spending is income, spending went up $100, income has to go up $100. Not so fast. Okay? The multiplier tells us that we're using the marginal propensity to consume here. So, if you have an increased level of spending, that can lead to a level of income that is higher than the initial level of spending. Okay? For this example, to show you how, in this example, I'm going to assume the marginal propensity to consume is 0.8. What that means is, for every extra dollar, for every $1 that someone earns, they spend 80 cents of it. Okay? It's 0.8. So if income goes up $100, someone's going to spend $80 of it. Okay? That's what we're looking at. So, let's start with person 1. Let's say that person 1 spends $100. They have it sitting in their bank account. They had $100 and they said, you know what, I want to go out and I want to have a good steak, right? So they spend $100. Right? And they spend it on person 2, right? They go, they get their steak, it's great. Here's $100. Thanks, that was delicious, right? So they spend $100. Well, remember, my spending is someone else's income. Okay? So I spend $100 and they now have $100 extra income. So person 2 has an extra $100 of income. Okay? Well, and this will be, we'll make this total spending. Or, no, total income. It's the total increase of income. Okay? So now, I've taken the $100, I went to a steakhouse, I went to Peter Luger's, maybe Edwards down in Jersey City, and I spent $100, right? I spent $100, and what ended up happening is someone else, person 2, ended up with $100 extra income. Okay. Now, remember, the marginal propensity to consume is 0.8, right? That's what I assume. Everyone has a propensity to consume of 0.8, which is very easy to calculate, by the way. People know the marginal propensity to consume of Jersey City, New Jersey, the Northeast, America, things like that. We know what our marginal propensity to consume is. You just average it out for everyone. Okay? So, let's say the marginal propensity to consume is 0.8, which I'm just assuming for this example. Well, when I spend $100 on the steak, what that caused was that person to get $100 extra income. Now with that $100 extra income, the steakhouse person, right, the owner, is not going to save all $100 of it. The marginal propensity to consume is 0.8. They're going to spend $80 of it. So person 2 spends $80. Okay? Maybe they go out to a nice dinner themselves. Okay? So they spend an extra $80. Okay? Meanwhile, what has happened to savings? Okay? Savings has gone up $20. Okay? They decided to save $20. The steakhouse that I went to saved 20 bucks. Okay? So, I spent $100 on someone else. They ended up having an extra $100, and then because of the marginal propensity to consume being 0.8, they spent $80 of it themselves on person 3. Okay? Meanwhile, they saved $20 of it. Now, when they spent the $80 on person 3, right, that gave person 3 an extra $80 worth of income. Okay? So, now we have an extra $80 worth of income for person 3, who has a marginal propensity to consume of 0.8. So person 3 is going to actually end up spending 80% of 80, which is $64. So they're going to spend $64. The difference, 80 minus 64, that's $16. So they're going to save $16. Person 3 is. Okay? Let's do one more. When they spent $64, maybe they decided to buy a laptop bag. I just looked at one. So when they buy a laptop bag, they're purchasing $64. They spend $64, which gives someone else more income. Okay? They spent the $64, and then person 4 spends 80% of $64, which I'm not sure what that is. Which is 51.2. Okay? So person 4 receives $64, they spend 80% of it, which means they spent $51.2, okay? Which means this person 4 saved about $13. Okay? This is where we can sort of cut off the example very briefly. What we've done, we have total savings. We'll label this the increased total savings, and I'm going to make another column over here called increased total income. Okay? So, what happened? Well, what I did was, I decided to go out for a nice steak dinner. And I took out some money from my savings account, and I spent $100. What that did is, it caused income at the steakhouse to go up $100, which they decided to save. They saved 20 of, but they spent 80. Okay? When they spent 80, that was another $80 worth of income. Okay? So far, income has gone up by $180. Okay? Then, the steakhouse, when they spent $80 and they bought themselves something, they spent $64. When they spent $64, that was $64 of income for person 4. Okay? And person 4 decided to spend 80% of 64, which was 51. The point being, if you did this over and over again, constantly, all the way to its logical end, you would find that income actually goes up $500. Okay? I'm just doing ... So what that means is if you followed it to the logical end, right? If you did 80% of 51, and then 80% of that, and then 80% of that, and then 80% of that, eventually, the total rise in income would be $500. This is the multiplier. What the multiplier is saying is that even though the increased level of spending was $100, right? I decided to go out and I bought a steak. Why? Because I felt like it. So I went out and I got a steak for $100. There was new spending. Any new increase in spending causes income to go up by an amount greater than the initial increase in spending, right? Increased level of spending was $100, but income went up by $500. What happened was this level of spending was multiplied. Hence we call it the multiplier. Okay? Our initial increase of spending caused income to go up by $500. Okay? Why? Because it kept being spent over and over again, right? A portion of it was spent over and over again. Okay? Meanwhile, if we did savings to the logical end, right? If we kept doing the spending exercise and saw what happened, if we look at how much people are saving, total savings would actually go up exactly $100. Okay? It would go up $100. So, here's what I'm trying to get at. You've learned the multiplier now. The multiplier is any increase of spending leads to a greater proportional increase of income, right? Spending went up by 100, but income went up by 500, right? So income went up in a greater proportion than spending, right? 100 versus 500. Meanwhile, savings, the increased level of savings was actually the exact amount that the initial increase of investment was, right? Investment went up by $100. Savings also went up by $100. Okay? So investment is equal to savings. I'm going to erase some of the board now. I'll erase this, so then we can still use these examples. That's just a note for me, okay? So I don't forget it. So, what has happened now? Okay, we've established that the increased level of investment, $100, caused savings to go up by exactly $100. Okay? I mentioned in week 3's lecture, in lecture 3, when we were talking about the market for loanable funds, I mentioned that the causality in the market for loanable funds goes like this. market for loanable funds, MLF. I mentioned that changes in savings lead to changes in investment via changes in the interest rate. Okay? I know it's a week for you guys, since you probably watched the lecture, but we said in the market for loanable funds, when there's an increased level of savings, that pushes down the interest rate. When the interest rate gets lowered, more people are willing to invest. If more people are willing to invest, then investment goes up. So what we said was changes in savings lead to changes in investment through changes in the interest rate. Okay? It's important to remember that the market for loanable funds is a theory. It's a theory. It's never been proved. Nobody's ever seen a market for loanable funds. Right? You go to a bank, you go to the stock market, you go to a bond market, etc. Plenty of other financial markets. You go to shadow banks, right? You go to investment banks. But you've never actually gone to the market for loanable funds. I'm not sure where it is. It is a theory. Okay? The multiplier, on the other hand, is an identity. Right? The only two things about the multiplier is that spending creates income. That's true, right? Anytime someone spends, the recipient of that spending gets income. And the second thing is the marginal propensity to consume, right? Out of every extra dollar someone spends, or out of every extra dollar someone earns, a portion of that is spent. Okay? So those are the two requisites for the multiplier. What the multiplier does is it shows us neoclassical economic theory is wrong. I'm going to explain why now. Okay? Here, with the multiplier, we saw that an increased level of investment led to an increased level of savings. So, it's actually, what the multiplier says is that changes in investment lead to changes in savings. Okay? Changes in investment lead to changes in savings. Okay? In other words, this increased investment led to increased savings. So investment led to savings. Okay? And it also happened through changes in income. Okay? It was through changes in income. Remember, I spent money on a steak that turned into someone's income. When they received more income, they decided to save some of it, and they decided to spend some of it. When they spent it, that gave someone else more income. They spent some of that, they saved some of it. Right? So the multiplier shows that changes in investment lead to changes in savings through changes in the interest, through changes in income. Okay? That's what it's saying here. Well, this seems to contradict the market for loanable funds. The market for loanable funds says that changes in savings lead to changes in investment through changes in the interest rate. So which one is right? As I mentioned before, the multiplier is an identity. The market for loanable funds is a theory, right? It's just what people believe. Well, this is true by definition. Changes in investment lead to changes in savings through changes in income. Okay? So if this is the way it works, then this is wrong, right? Then maybe the market for loanable funds is wrong. Why does that matter? Okay. Well, if there's no market for loanable funds, then that means Say's law is wrong. And if Say's law is wrong, then the neoclassical model is wrong. Okay? Let me piece that together for you. Say's law, or well, the neoclassical model, one of the four components of the neoclassical model is Say's law. And the major component of Say's law is the market for loanable funds. Okay? Well, Keynes used the multiplier to show that changes in investment lead to changes in savings through changes in income. Okay? That's what Keynes used the multiplier for. He showed, with the multiplier, Keynes showed how an increase of investment can lead to a higher than proportional increase of income. Okay? And he also showed, in doing so, he showed how changes in investment lead to changes in savings through changes in income. There's no disputing it. Right? It's an identity. It cannot be argued with. It's true by definition. Well, if this is true, if investment leads to savings through income, and that's true, then savings cannot lead to investment through the interest rate. Okay? It means that this causality is wrong. Well, if that causality is wrong, then it means the market for loanable funds is wrong. And if the market for loanable funds is wrong, then that means there's no such thing as Say's law. And if there's no such thing as Say's law, the neoclassical model has lost one of its four major components. Okay? So, since the neoclassical model needs Say's law, and Say's law needs the market for loanable funds, if this is wrong, which this shows that this is wrong. If this is wrong, then you can't have a market for loanable funds, and if you don't have the market for loanable funds, then there's no such thing as neoclassical theory. I guess you could have a theory, right? It's a theory, but it would not be applicable to the real world. Okay? You could think that's the way it works, but it's not the way it works. So, what you end up getting is Keynes smashing neoclassical economic theory. Okay? You have him completely destroying 60, 70 years worth of economic thought. Okay? So, why am I spending so much time on this? Well, one, Keynes destroyed the neoclassical theory. He showed that it's just wrong. Secondly, this led him to what's called the paradox of thrift. Okay? I mentioned in our second lecture, and I'm going to erase some of this now, just put this back up on the board. Okay? Keynes came up with the paradox of thrift, which is very important for explaining policy now. Okay? Remember, Keynes used the multiplier to show that there's no such thing as the market for loanable funds. Okay? Well, if politicians believe this and they try to raise the savings rate, then what you end up getting is, and since this is wrong, you'll actually end up crashing the economy. Keynes summarized this with the paradox of thrift. Keynes said that, and this is the paradox of thrift, while savings is good for the individual, right? It's good for you to save. There's no doubting about that. It's good for you to save. It gives you more money in the future. While it's good for you to save, if everyone does it, it's bad for the economy. Okay? That's Keynes's paradox of thrift. It's a paradox because it's something you can't believe is true. Right? It's the paradox of thrift. While thrift being savings, while thrift is good for one person, if everyone does it, it's bad for all of us, right? Because remember, for Keynes, effective demand is everything. So if you end up saving more, right? If everyone decides to save, then cash registers don't go off. And if cash registers don't go off, then we don't need people to work at the stores, which means there will be unemployment, and lots of it. Okay? Keynes showed the only way, and this is another paradox, he showed the only way to increase savings is to actually spend more. Okay? It may sound counterintuitive, but the only way to save more is if people spend. Why? Because the more people spend, the more you will be able to save, because your income will be going up, right? The more your income is going up, the more you can save. And the only way to make income go up is if people spend, right? The only way you can get income to go up is if employment goes up. And the only way to get employment to go up is if people spend a lot, okay? So if people spend, then income rises, which means then people can start saving from that income. But if everyone decides to save, then unemployment will go up. If unemployment goes up, no one has jobs, then income goes down, which you can't save income that doesn't exist. Okay? So Keynes called that the paradox of thrift. Why is that important? Well, because when it comes to policy, neoclassicals wanted to encourage people to save. Keynes wanted to encourage people to spend. Okay? Neoclassicals want people to save because they think that will push down interest rates, which will then cause people to invest more. Keynes said, no, 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 that's completely wrong. Instead, if you want people to save more, and you want the economy to get going, you need to spend, and the more people spend, that's going to bring people back to work, which will raise income, and once income is going up, then we can all start saving as much as we would like to. Okay? But the paradox of thrift is, and this is really the paradox of thrift, the only way to raise savings is to actually spend more. It sounds counterintuitive, that's why it's a paradox. Okay? But the multiplier, which is an identity, right? This is a theory, this is an identity. The multiplier shows that it's true. The only way to save more is to increase spending, right? You spend more, more people go to work, which raises income, and then people can save out of it. Okay? On the other hand, if people decide to try to save more, right? If people just decide, you know what, I'm saving everything I have now. If everyone does that, what's going to happen is savings goes up and spending goes down. If spending goes down, cash registers don't go off, and if that happens, people start getting fired. If a lot of people get fired, well then income goes down, and you can't save income when it doesn't exist. Okay? It's a lot harder to save $10 when your income is $10 than it is to save $10 when your income is $100. Okay? If your income is $100 an hour, you could save 10 bucks, no problem. But if you make $10 an hour, saving $10 is pretty darn hard. Okay? Well, Keynes used the multiplier to show the only way to get income to go up, or the only way to get savings up, was to get income to go up. The only way to get income to go up was by increasing savings. Okay? So, that wraps up our treatment of Keynes's principle of effective demand and consumption. In the second part of the lecture, we're going to talk about Keynes's theory of investment. Okay? So, I'm going to shut the camera off now, and then I'll turn it back on in a couple minutes, a little bit, actually 30 seconds, and then we'll talk about Keynes's investment theory.